I think we're all here now. Those of you who are just arriving, perhaps you could pop in the chat box where you're coming from, what your place is, and share with us a sense of what is meaningful to you about the place in which you live and work. But we're going to begin now, just to be respectful of time. So we've got about maybe 45 minutes together today. If you have to hop off before we finish, no problem. Just give us a wave as you go. And in that time, I'm going to take the first 20 to maybe 25 minutes to share a little more with you about the course, what we'll cover and how the course works. And then the rest of the time is open for questions, any questions you may have. And we can do those questions live if you like, or if you'd like to come on, or you can put your questions in the chat box and I'll scroll through and answer as many as I can in the time. Okay, so let's begin. So firstly, a little bit more about me for those of you who don't know me so well. I've spent most of my career in brand strategy and communications, corporate social responsibility and sustainability narratives, working with global brands that you might recognize, like Levi Strauss, like Patagonia, like Timberland, like GlaxoSmithKline and Peugeot, tech scale-ups in renewable energy, food systems and construction, and working with NGOs on systems change campaigns. So you might wonder why Really Regenerative, which is my first community interest organization, why we're focused on place, which is a long story, but it is a simple one, so I can make it short. And there are three important points. So firstly, for me, it's about the story of separation, which is an ancient story which we are living out today, which is about the separation of us humans from nature, which has resulted in the ecological harm and depletion of soils and oceans and deforestation, a loss of biodiversity that we see happening around us. It's about the separation between humans and other humans, which manifests as everyday sexism, racism, nationalism, inequality, a continuing colonialism, the polarization that we see accelerated by social media, about competition as foundational to organizational and economic design across our societies around the world. And it's about thousands of years of valuing the masculine psychological qualities like assertion, like competitiveness, like single tasking, over the more feminine psychological qualities like collaboration and compassion. And I want to emphasize that is not about gender, it is about the qualities of our psychology. And finally, it's about a long period of prioritizing our outer existence, what other people think of us, how things look, our identity and our individualism over our inner development. And all those stories of separation are really very much easier to begin to address in place. So secondly, after many years working on systems change from a global perspective and a long time studying complexity, one of the things that was becoming increasingly apparent to me was that the levels of complexity that we are dealing with are infinitely harder and slower to be able to make the kind of change in that is urgently needed. It's not impossible, it's just harder and slower. Global systems are a lot more moribund and slow to respond to change of that complexity than local systems or working locally. So even though, like lots of people I've worked with, I was trained to think globally, I began to realize the power of coming at systems change from a bottom-up local perspective. And the third thing is about people and complexity. So just as systems are complex, so are people. As we have advanced as a species, we have developed. We have developed psychologically. There are many different foundational worldviews in different cultural heritages that shape who we are. In any one group of people you can put in a room, there are many different personalities, there are many different characters. And there are many different experiences of life that also shape us to become who we are and how we respond. So that's a lot of complexity that you're dealing with, even in a small group of 4 or 5 or 6 people. And in addition to that, there's a whole world of collective and individual trauma in human experience that has been building up over many generations. So when we create anything that looks like a change program, we're dealing with all that complexity in people, whether it's across a supply chain or a global system. And the simple answer is, again, it's easier and more visceral and more real to work with that in place in a very local and face-to-face context. For example, if I buy meat from my local butcher, I know him. I can ask him, I know where the meat comes from. I can ask him about how it's lived. It's very easy for me to find out even what its pathway to the slaughterhouse has been, what its experience has been, if I choose to buy meat. But if I buy it from my local multiple retail store, despite global labeling, I have no clue about its provenance. If I want to build my own personal courage and capacity for interhuman dialogue, I have a marvelous opportunity to do that if and when I find myself confronting living next door to somebody who is a disruptive neighbor who's causing mayhem in the neighborhood. It's at a very visceral level. I'm called to step up and be a better human right there. So for me, place is the most powerful interface between natural systems and human systems. It's the most powerful interface for the story of separation between humans, and it's the most powerful interface for personal and systemic development to happen. And that's what we've tried to design into Power of Place as a learning journey, albeit at a starter level. Okay, so on to what's in the journey. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. Okay, perfect, here we go. So the course really is all about finding a way to move from an anthropocentric, so human-centric way of designing places to a more living systems design, which is effectively how nature has successfully operated for about 3.8 billion years. So we're looking throughout the course at the principles of how nature has worked and seeing how we can apply those to regenerative placemaking within a context of systems thinking, if that makes sense. So how do we really describe what regenerative placemaking is? It's a new and emerging discipline or practice, and I would describe it as a way of aligning and activating people's cultural potential as cultural and environmental evolutionists of place to heal the story of separation that I talked about earlier. But you might also talk about it as combining all of the placemaking practices that we have been looking at for many decades now, a really rigorous, new and different way of doing community engagement, but also a commitment to development, to human development and systems development and evolution. Combined together in one discipline. So there are 3 key premises in the course. The first of which is that humans have a powerful role to play on planet Earth as catalysts for systemic evolution. And we look in the first part of the course at what that means and how we discover that role in terms of our place and our projects in place. The second premise is that to change the way we design, we have to change the way we think. And that means a commitment to human development and evolutionary development of our ecology around us as part of the projects that we do. So woven throughout the course are acupuncture moments that ask you to look at and develop your way of thinking and help you to do that with your teams and within the system in which you sit. And the third principle is that regenerative places are designed using living systems, design, culture, and being. So drawing from those key principles of how nature works. And all those three premises are woven throughout the entire 14 weeks. And that means that we work on three key inquiries. How do we discover the role we have ourselves, our teams, and our projects can have within the systems in which we sit? How do we ensure we are developers of our own thinking and the thinking of others, and constantly build the capacity for regenerative thinking in the place in which we work? And how do we design regenerative places, create regenerative cultures, and embody regenerative qualities as leaders in our places? So sometimes I think it's actually easier to think about, to understand what our work on role might be, which is the first couple of weeks in the course, by looking at some examples. So for example, if you're a private estate owner, what are your challenges in the 21st century? There may not be private estates in your country, but there are quite a few of them in mine, which is the UK. So your challenges are, how do you continue to raise enough finance to manage vast tracts of land and sometimes ancient buildings that are in your care? How do you manage the fact that you will be having to pay inheritance tax when this current generation passes onwards? How do you diversify? How do you create new streams of income? How do you engage with local communities like villages that are part of your landscape? If, for example, you want to regenerate lots of ancient buildings, build homes, build new business centres on your land, and your local community simply doesn't want any change, how do you engage with the local custodians of nature and natural capital commodities like water boards, like councils, like national park management organizations? And what if that you looked at what your role within all of those systems might be, rather than focusing on solving all of those problems? Then you find, for example, that in your history, you have a historic role as a center in the Middle Ages to which people came for birthing support and advice. What if you found that you had a historic role in dialogue and conflict resolution in the area as a pattern? We look at patterns and flows of energy in this part of the course. What might that tell you about how you build your future strategy from a role perspective? If your role might be, for example, to hold inquiry in everything you do into what the role of a private estate owner is in the 21st century. So what if you're a city council and a city developer looking to, build more developments in your area? What are your challenges? Your challenges are that in most countries, local authorities get funding from their national governments and legal demands from national governments to build a certain amount of housing. You have a real challenge finding large enough plots of land on which to meet that demand to build the amount of houses that you are being asked to build for growing populations. You will always have community issues where you decide to build that some people want it and others won't. But what, for example, if you looked at the patterns and flows, if you found a piece of land that you could develop, and perhaps you decided that you wanted to build the most sustainable development yet built in your country as an exemplar, as a role model going forwards, and that you could make it curb free, you could make it car free, you could design it with modular circular design so that everything that you built could be recycled. That would be a marvelous role example. But if you didn't look for historical ecological patterns and economic patterns of activity and flows of people and wildlife through the area, you might miss the fact that this has always been an outward looking community from which has departed explorers and naval communities, unfortunately looking to colonize the world, in the case of what I'm looking at here on the screen, which happens to be a town on the south coast of England. You might miss the fact that you'd actually dammed up quite a lot of the flows of nature and energy by reclaiming land and filling in rivers and estuaries that are really rich in biodiversity. You might miss the fact that whilst the culture has been really outward looking, it's actually depleted the ecological heart of the harbour, and people, when they express their story of place, talk about not having an identity. You might miss the fact that this is a place where post-traumatic stress disorder was first studied. You might miss the fact that the only building on this piece of land is a school for special needs. And if you looked at all of those things, what might that tell you about the role of this development in your place, in your city, and in your region? That whilst it could take a marvelous role as a technological exemplar, it could also incorporate an outward-looking aspect by looking at perhaps creating a marine technology centre on the island, but also have a really strong look at being inwardly healing. What might that cause you to incorporate in your design for this particular place, the role of this place? So what about if you're on a small island and you look at it differently, and you happen to be living on a place where you want to eat locally grown organic food, and it simply isn't possible because the food system on the island happens to be mainly international supermarkets that import food, and the average food security of the island is 1.5 days. And the organic farming that existed on the island has no access to the existing food distribution system because they can't produce enough quality at the right time to be attractive to supermarket retailers. You might create a project by looking at the entire economic, ecological, social and cultural system that addresses the excluded minority of those organic farmers that are left, by creating a local food store where their produce, whatever produce they make, is sold to the local community. But that wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have other interventions as part of that project. So you might be creating innovative recipes in a kitchen that's part of your project that allows people to sample local food and get back to enjoying the taste of what can be grown locally. You might have a series of cultural interventions that are art-based to encourage people to experiment and change the way in which they view food and they look at food. You might get a group of chefs together and look at experimenting with what additional food can be foraged as well as grown on the island, in order to suddenly create a market in which organic farmers can sustain themselves, and in which way you would change the landscape of the local food system and culture. Or what about if you want to direct funding for growth of place-based regenerative agriculture projects or regenerative land-based projects in places like Africa or Asia in a different way from the current existing aid system? That you really want to develop capacity for regeneration through those projects, you might set up something like this, which is Regenerosity. It's a new organization that, while it is partnering with the existing philanthropic system and directing funding towards regenerative projects in those continents, it's also asking those philanthropists to look at what it takes to to recreate philanthropy in a regenerative capacity, how you can also use it to develop human capacity and human psychology alongside philanthropic investment. What about if you're in tourism and you're an island destination, for example? What are your challenges? Your challenges are to revitalize an entire economy in a post-COVID environment in which more people have become aware of how impactful, in a negative sense, global tourism is and how much it needs to change. So what would happen if you looked at the patterns and flows in your area? How could that inform your story and strategy going forward? Well, what if you noticed that historical patterns and over many millennia on this island had really been, or group of islands, had really been about rest, provisioning and revitalization, whether that is the very smart Levada water systems that gather copious rainfall and store it and funnel it and channel it to individual households all around the island so that they can grow their own food, to the fact that it is a destination past which whales migrate and rest on their northward journey in the Atlantic. What might that tell you about your how to design your future strategy for tourism, for example? So I hope those are a number of ways in which that bring alive one of the ideas that we look at, which is how you find a regenerative systemic role around which you can build story and strategy, which is the first part of our course. Okay, so on to the practical things about how the journey works. There are 12 live sessions of 2 hours over 12 weeks, starting on September the 9th. And we finish with 2 extra days on the 2nd and 3rd of December, which we call the gathering, in which we all come together and look at the projects that we've been working on and what we've learned over the period and collectively share that together. You'll receive pre-reading materials and videos to study in advance of each live session. We'll also work in small cohorts during the whole journey. Some of you may join as a team and stay together in that group. Those of you that join as individuals, we help form groups for you to work with. But there's also plenty of opportunity during the live sessions to meet other people in the breakout sessions that we have. So over the period of the 14 weeks, there's plenty of opportunity to engage with people from other countries, other fields of place-based work, and learn from each other. During the course, it's really important to us that whilst we're providing knowledge, and we'll be discussing and thinking about that knowledge and learning in the context of our own projects, that we also create opportunities to activate and take action with the knowledge and the learning that we're looking at. So there is an assignment each week that builds across the course that helps you either look retrospectively at a project that you've just completed from a point of view of what if we had done it this way, or if it gives you an opportunity to develop a new project from a new perspective, or if you feel that you can, to apply some of the learning and practices and qualities on an existing project. There's reflective disruption of our own thinking all the way throughout the course. And as I said, at the end, we get an opportunity to share together our learning and reflections in some live fish bowls. We do have some special guests along on the journey from the regenerative community, people like Daniel Christian Weil, who many of you may know from the brilliant book he wrote, Designing Regenerative Cultures. But the people who join us will be dependent on the shape of the cohort. If we have lots of people from tourism, for example, Anna Pollock, who is one of the foundational leaders in designing and building regenerative tourism strategies, or Anton Chernikov, for example, who's doing a lot of work here in the UK together with estates to design new opportunities for connections between rural economies and urban economies, particularly with a focus on building intergenerational communities on these estates. That might be interesting, but it very much depends on the final makeup of our cohort, and each one is different. So I'm often asked, well, what will we actually learn about during the 14 weeks? Some people find it a long time, some people obviously don't find it a long time, but we do pack a lot in. So at the end of the course, I would hope that you would be able to identify an evolutionary and transformative role that your work or your project or your organization can play in the system in which it sits. I'd hope that you would have some good insights on how to co-creatively shape a future story that underpins the strategy you're working on, and have a way to do that together with all of the stakeholders who are going to be part of that, including nature, including the public, including finance. We'll look at a number of different stakeholders that we should include in every single project that we do. And how to design a culture and environment in which difference is truly celebrated instead of division created. So those interpersonal dialogue skills will be part of the second half of the course. How to identify your own paradigm of thought, where your thinking comes from, where other people's thinking comes from, and the ability to constantly disrupt your thinking so that your work is consistently regenerative rather than being recaptured by our current way of thinking and working. And obviously how to integrate regenerative design, culture, and being in your leadership and your work. So we cover the principles of living systems. We cover practices of how to consistently change our thinking. We look at developing strategic narratives. We look at finding individual projects and systemic roles. We learn about acting as an ecosystem acupuncturist, whether that's being an urban acupuncturist, a rural acupuncturist, or a cultural acupuncturist, creating change in place. We really work on building vitalized community around all of the projects that we do. And we dive deep into how we deal with what I call human messiness. We're all human. We're all victim to unconscious bias. We all carry with us opinions, some trauma. We all carry baggage with us that we have to find ways to get past in order to create transformative change. And at the end, we are looking at the vision and pathway and how we get to the create a plan, an agile and adaptable plan of activity that will help you move towards the end state that you discover. So how can you get involved? You can register via our website on reallyregenerative.org, Power of Place. You can download the perspective from the link that I've put in the chat box and register from there. Those of you who are on a very tight budget, or if you're not working, you've lost your employment during the COVID pandemic, can apply for up to a 50% bursary, but they're limited mainly for new charities, new social enterprises, and startups who are still generating funding. Very practical, what are the costs? We, Really Regenerative, we operate a gift economy policy, so give what you can, take what you need. So the base camp prices are basically what it costs us to operate the course. We are a not-for-profit organization, but if you can pay more than that, we do encourage you to do so, because that means we can put a small amount of money into our local projects that we do in the southeast of England, and it means that we can offer more bursary places to those people who can't currently access the cost. We've designed it to be as accessible as possible, and we have budgets for individuals, for teams of 3 and teams of 4. But if you want to come together as a team of more than that, just email me at jenny@reallyregenerative.org, and we can have a discussion about what works for you. Okay, so that is the end of my information today, and it's now time to open up for some questions from you, and I'm going to turn off the record so that you can feel confident. You can ask your whatever questions you would like to ask without them being aired to the wider public.